So you're going to the Renaissance Festival and you want to make your own outfit, but you don't know how to sew. Or maybe you're simply not super confident in your sewing skills at this point, but you really want to make at least part of the outfit.
Make the skirt!
A skirt is, arguably, one of the simpler clothing items to construct. Definitely easier than, say, a corset or trousers, and is an excellent project to figuratively dip thy toes into the pool that is costume construction. Now you may be thinking, but what about closures? I really don't feel comfortable putting zippers in yet. Don't need one. Elastic? Don't need it. Buttons? Nope. Okay, I really don't want to use Velcro. Nah. Ugh. Snaps? But what if someone steps on the hem of my skirt, undoing all the snaps, revealing my non-historical undergarments for everyone to gawk at? Well, I guess you could make historical undergarments, but it might be easier to just forego snaps. That's right, I'm gonna make a skirt with no closures, possibly finish it in one day, and potentially be able to lend it to a friend, even if they're a couple sizes different from me.
To fashion the skirt, I would be using this tablecloth I discovered at the thrift store. It seemed rather RenFaire-esque. I'm not sure though. I've never actually been to a RenFaire. I contemplated which side of the fabric to use as my right side. I preferred the way that the design stood out on the back of the tablecloth, so I determined that the wrong side would now be the right side. It seems to have originally been purchased from Walmart. Unfortunately, it wasn't 100% cotton, but for $3, I'm not complaining. The measurements needed are waist to floor and around the widest part of the hips. Fold that tablecloth in half and lop off about 4.5 inches right along the fold. As it's cut on the fold, it should be 9 inches when you unfold it. After unfolding that piece, from it you'll harvest a 1.5 inch wide strip, which is going to serve as your lacing, so set that aside for later. Now take that waistband piece and measure out the length you measured for your hips plus 3 inches and give it the chop. That is your waistband. The smaller piece right below is going to give us lacing loops. To make those loops, cut from the little piece 1.5 inch wide strips, 2 of them, then fold those strips in half and stitch them together at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Same with the lacing strip, it's just a wee bit longer. Fold in half and sew at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now take all those newly crafted cylinders, trim the excess, and flip them inside out. You can do this using a safety pin or a loop turner or a bobby pin or a grappling hook. There are many methods by which to do this. You do what works best for you. I was hoping to use only the fabric from the tablecloth for this project and not purchase any additional items, but unfortunately because of the length of the lacing and the quality of the fabric, this turned out to be an unachievable goal, so I would need to source lacing from somewhere else. But I wasn't going anywhere that day. The rains had come down to moisturize the earth, and we were trapped. Okay, that was a bit dramatic. And a poor excuse to stay home. I probably could have gotten out going up the road in the other direction later in the day, but I really didn't want to go anywhere. And I had puddles to jump in. And my assistance was needed at home anyway, because someone else enjoyed the puddles far more than I did.
Hey you. Look at you. You need a bath, huh? Did you have fun? Yeah. Yeah, I know you don't want to take a bath, do you? You can't come inside until you take a bath, okay?
Well, the lacing didn't turn out, but the tubes for the loops turned out just fine. Speaking of loops, going back to the waistband, I wanted to give it a center back seam so that I could sew a little loop right at the top. This is an extra step, it's not necessary, it will simply help to keep the waistband from slipping down. I took that waistband piece, folded it in half, and sliced it right down the middle. Now it was in 3 pieces. This one on the fold is the front, these 2 are the back. I cut a little strip of fabric about 4 inches long and 1.5 inches wide, and then used the same method as the other loops to make a short little single loop. This waistband is ultimately going to be folded in half, so I marked the halfway point and then laid the little tube right where the fold would be, looped it around, pinned it into place, and encased it into that center back seam by laying the other back piece right on top of it before stitching. And then I had what I like to call a security loop. Now some more measuring and marking has to occur. Take some chalk, mark the middle of the waistband, that's where the fabric will fold, so it is going to be the top of the waistband. Then mark your seam allowance on the bottom and on the side. Now take those tubes, loop them into loops, and pin them along the sides in between the marks.
Ba-ba-da-ba-ba.
Now press the side seam containing the loops toward the front. The loops are going to point toward the back. Here you can stabilize the seam with the loops in it with some interfacing, or even better, some boning if you have some. It's not necessary, but it will make it look much better and it will be much easier to lace up. I didn't stabilize it because I wanted to keep this project as simple as possible, but if you make this skirt, it's totally up to you to stabilize or not to stabilize, but only do half of it because you're going to fold it in half. Then I top stitched the seams to make sure that the loops always stayed pointed towards the back. Now for the larger portion of the skirt. You should have two large rectangular shapes. Lay them flat on top of each other and pin them together along the short sides. Then stitch them together. You should end up with a long and wide tube. Run the sewing machine along the top edge of that tube using the biggest stitch, and then again one more row of stitching. Now we attach the giant tube to the little tube, i.e. the skirt to the waistband. The skirt is going to get attached to the waistband edge closest to the loops. Put them right sides together, pin, and gather to fit. And pin some more. Now stitch into place. Press that other edge of the waistband over a seam allowance. Flip the waistband in half so that it meets the other seam, covering the raw edge, pin in place, and stitch. You can either hand stitch or machine stitch, entirely up to you. Then comes the matter of concealing any proof that this was once a tablecloth. You could seam rip the tag off, but I opted to simply cut it and then cover it with thread, as that was the faster, easier option. Give that waistband a good press and then go in search of some form of lacing. My form was in the shape of a couple of shoelaces I found at the thrift store for 25 cents. I tied them together to make a longer lacing and laced them through the loops. Lacing through that center loop there just ensures that the skirt won't slip down. Then slip it on, lace it up. You'll kind of have to arrange some things here and there to make it look nice and neat. I like to lace it in the front because I have more control this way, or you could ask a friend to help. And you can wear it like this with the lacing in the front, or you can circle it around to be in the back. And there is the adjustable skirt. We are ready for the RenFaire. Oh, you wanted to see how I made this bodice?
Well, if you insist.
You may recognize this jacket from a previous video where I chopped it up to create a costume. I saved the rest of it because there was still plenty left to work with, and I knew a time would come when I could give it new life. I deconstructed all of the pieces, and since I had used up almost the entire front piece on one side, I was going to have to reconstruct that, but I had a whole sleeve with which to do that, so I just used the other front piece as a pattern and cut the other front piece out of the sleeve. Once I had all of my pieces, I pinned them together and tried it on. It was a little loose in the back, so I gave it a center back seam, splitting it into two pieces, pinned it together, tried it on again, and then made a few more adjustments. I needed the neck to come down a little bit and the hem to shorten, and then I just trimmed off all of the excess fabric, making sure to leave a seam allowance. And then I had all of my pattern pieces, side front, front, back, and side back. I basted them all together and had another try on. It wasn't fitting quite to my liking. I wanted it to come in a little bit at the waist, so I nipped it in by marking where my natural waist hit, and then took all of those seams in just a smidge, tried it on again, loved it, and then trimmed the seams to have the correct seam allowance. I took out all of those basting stitches and laid the pieces flat. These would serve as pattern pieces for the other fabric because, you know, I had to make this bodice reversible. It offers versatility and stability. It's very sensible. The choice of other fabric was this remnant that I had recently been gifted. It was nice and thick. I just cut out all of those pieces out of the sturdy fabric. I felt that the jacket fabric was not quite thick enough, so I decided to stabilize it with a thrifted tablecloth because that's what I had on hand. I cut out 2 layers of the tablecloth and backed the jacket fabric with that. Then I had all of my pieces complete and ready for assemblage. I stitched all of the pieces together, back to side back to side front, and side front to front, and the same on the other bodice. I wanted to keep this project as simple as possible in terms of supplies, so I elected to not add boning. Instead, I used flat felled seams on the sturdier fabric. I did this by trimming one edge of the seam allowance and then tucking the now larger seam allowance underneath it and then stitching it into place. As the fabric was sturdy, this would hopefully add just a little bit of stability to the bodice. Not as good as boning, but it's better than nothing. I opted to not do that on the other side of the bodice because the extra layers had already made it rather fluffy, and it would have been a little too much work to make flat felled seams, so I simply pressed them flat and stitched them down. Then it was time to make some more loops. I used the same method as I did with the skirt. I cut strips of fabric, folded them in half, ran them through the sewing machine, trimmed the seams, and pulled them through with a loop turner. I did end up cutting them into individual little loops. This is another method. You can use one long continuous piece, or you can cut all the loops into separate little pieces. I pinned those into place along both front edges and then realized I needed a few more little cinnamon sticks. Now had come the time to attach both bodices together, right sides together, leaving an opening to flip it out. But before I did that, I wanted to go ahead and show how you can stabilize fabric for the lacing. And you can use this same method on the skirt if you want to stabilize your lacing on the waistband without boning. Of course, you can use boning for this step, but I know that boning is not always accessible, and so I wanted to show a method without it. You can use some sturdy fusible interfacing, or you can take a scrap piece of sturdy fabric, stitch it to the inside of the lacing seam, and then you will have 4 layers instead of 2. And then you'll attach that to the other bodice, and you'll have even more layers. Boning is always best, but this is an option if you can't access boning. Once that is stabilized, then you can sew the bodice's right sides together all along the edges, leaving an opening to pull it through. But before you pull it through, make sure to cut the corners, and then you can clip the curves, or you can just simply cut really close to the seam, which is what I did. Then I turned it inside out, pushed out all the little corners, gave it a good press, and then pinned that opening closed. So this is going to get top stitched closed, and I wanted to go ahead and top stitch the entire bodice. It's not necessary, but I feel like it makes it look much more crisp and neat and will prevent you having to reshape it and press it if you were to launder it. For the armholes, you can absolutely cover these with bias tape, which would probably be easier, but I really wanted to keep the purchases to a minimum with this project, so I opted to use a different method. I stitched around the edge of the armholes with a different color thread so I could see it. I clipped the curves, not going past that stitching line, and then pressed the seams over. Did the same thing on the other bodice, and then brought those newly clean edges to meet. I pinned them together and then top stitched, and this is what one side looks like, and that's what the other side looks like. Then I just removed any stitches that were visible and grabbed some cotton lacing, laced it up, and it was finished. And of course, the bodice is reversible. You can't tell very well in these images, but it does look very different in person. And I like them both, but I think I prefer the side with the sturdier fabric. I think the dark brown in it goes really well with the skirt. What do you think? Which bodice is best? Now, is this costume historically accurate?
No.
But as I understand it, Renaissance fairgoers are not incredibly concerned with historical accuracy in costume. I do believe if you're working at the fair, there are probably certain stipulations to follow, but if you're simply visiting, I think it's mostly up to you, I think. The only downside with using the tablecloth is it did limit the amount of skirt I had, so the swish factor is not super stellar, but the hem is wide enough to take fairly long strides if necessary.